When the plane went down, I had already been out of the hangar for a few months. My badge was tucked away in a kitchen drawer, mixed in with old bills and papers you keep long after they've stopped mattering. I woke up early that morning, like I always did, even without a shift to report to. The radio was on low, more out of habit than interest. That's where I heard the airline's name, then the flight number, and finally the word, "Nobody wants," tied to something they know too well. Crash. They didn't say my name. Not then. They didn't say anyone's name that I recognized. They talked about a failure, about conditions still under investigation, about procedures, the usual language that fills the space before blame finds a place to land. I stayed seated at the table, coffee going cold, staring out the window as if I could see the hangar from there. I couldn't. The plane went down a few hundred miles from where I used to work. Not our runway, not our town, but it was the same model. The same kind of aircraft I had watched taxi out and come back hundreds of times. The same engine sound on startup. The same slight vibration before lining up on the runway. To people on the outside, that doesn't mean much. To someone who spent a lifetime with grease on his hands and his ears tuned to noises no manual ever mentions, it means everything. The first few hours were confused, the way they always are. Nobody knew exactly how many people were on board. Nobody confirmed names. The footage that showed up later was distant, shaky, filmed from too far away to show anything that mattered. I didn't watch. Not out of delicacy, but because there was nothing there I hadn't already seen in another form. A plane on the ground isn't a plane anymore. It's just metal in the wrong place. I didn't call anyone that day. Nobody called me either. Officially, I wasn't part of the operation anymore. On paper, I had no connection to it. Still, there was a strange feeling, like someone had gone back and touched something I'd left behind without fixing properly. Not guilt, not yet. More like an old unease you recognize without knowing what to call it. The days that followed were filled with a kind of noisy silence. News reports, repeating the same phrases. Experts who had never set foot in a hangar, explaining how airplanes work. People talking about aviation like it was a household appliance. I listened just enough to know where things stood. I already knew how this would go. Sooner or later, the focus would shift away from the crash itself and land on procedures. It always does. The impact becomes background. Paper takes center stage. That's when I started feeling something that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't relief either. It was displacement, like I was standing a few steps outside a scene I'd been part of, watching it from the wrong angle, unable to say exactly when I'd moved out of frame. I wasn't in the hangar anymore. I wasn't on shift. I wasn't in the meetings. And still, all of it had started while I was. A few people asked how I was doing. Not many. Most didn't know what to ask. Others figured it was better not to bring it up at all. I never blamed them. Technical disasters make people uneasy. They're not like car wrecks or sudden illness. They carry that uncomfortable idea that someone, somewhere, might have done something differently. I answered the same way every time. Said I was all right, said I was following the information, said it was too early for conclusions. Safe phrases, neutral, the kind that don't lock you into anything. I probably learned how to talk like that on the job. As time passed, the coverage thinned out. That was expected. There's always something else waiting for attention. Another story, another emergency. The crash stopped being daily news and became a reference point. Something mentioned now and then when people talked about safety or oversight. That's when the silence really started. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the absence of questions. Around that time, I started sorting through things at home, not because I needed to, but because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do. Old boxes, paperwork that no longer had a purpose, notebooks with notes that only made sense years ago. In one of those boxes, I found maintenance reports from earlier years, yellowed pages, signatures from people who had retired or passed on, handwritten remarks, rushed and practical, written by someone who needed to record something before moving on to the next task. I spent a while looking at those papers. There was nothing wrong with them. At least nothing you could point to easily. Everything was dated, signed, filed, the kind of documentation that gives the impression of order. And maybe that was what bothered me most. The idea that everything can look organized even when, underneath, decisions are being quietly pushed down the road. I didn't reread them looking for mistakes. I wasn't trying to clear myself or condemn myself. I looked at them the way you look at old photographs, recognizing the setting, remembering the moment, trying to understand why it all felt normal back then. Because it did. It honestly did. That was also when I got the first more direct, official contact. Not a formal summons. Just a notice that at some point, they might need clarification. The language was careful, respectful. Nobody accused anyone. A system that knows what it's doing, avoids accusations until the last possible moment. It didn't keep me up at night. What kept me up were the small things. A detail remembered at the wrong hour. A procedure that had seemed routine at the time, and now carried a different weight. Not because it had been wrong, but because it might have been right at the edge of what was allowed. And edges are tricky. You only see them clearly after you've gone past them. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I found myself thinking less about the crash and more about the time before it. Not the last few days, but months, sometimes years earlier. How often someone said, "We can keep an eye on it." How often I thought the same, not out of carelessness, out of adaptation, because real work is adaptation. No operation runs exactly the way the manual says it should. Anyone who's spent enough time in the field learns that early. The question is what you do with that knowledge. I didn't have answers then, just the growing sense that the accident hadn't started on the day of the flight. It had started much earlier, in decisions spread thin over time, in small allowances too modest to draw attention. And the silence afterward only made that clearer. When I was finally called in for a more formal conversation, it wasn't in a dark room or some distant building. It was an ordinary office with an ordinary table and ordinary chairs. Ordinary people asking technical questions. I answered what I knew, and what I knew was what I'd always known. Everything had been within accepted limits, within the manual, within what had been considered sufficient for years. None of those words brought any comfort. I walked out of that room with the sense that everything had been explained, and still incomplete. Like we had described every part of the machine, but not the habit that had formed around it, the way decisions get postponed, the way acceptable slowly stretches without anyone noticing the exact moment it goes too far. I wasn't formally suspended. I wasn't accused. I wasn't cleared either. My role in the story ended the way many long careers end, without ceremony, without closure, without a final sentence. It just ended. That's why I can talk about it now. Not because I'm free of blame, but because I don't need to defend myself anymore. The plane went down, people died. The system moved on, and I was left with the memories, not of the crash itself, but of everything that came before it. When nothing felt urgent enough to fix that day. If I go back now, it isn't to change what happened. That's beyond anyone. I go back because before the impact, there were ordinary days, ordinary choices, quiet adjustments. That's where the story really begins. Not when the plane hit the ground the wrong way, but in the years it kept flying, even though it was no longer exactly the aircraft the manual described. That's what I remember, and that's why I'm telling it. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It never does. There's no clean moment when life stops and acknowledges what just happened. What came instead was a strange slowing down, like a machine that keeps running for a while even after the power's been cut, burning through whatever energy is left. In the first weeks, everything was noise. Not sound exactly, but information. Official statements, short notices, carefully chosen words meant to say just enough without saying too much. I've always found it strange how, After an accident, everyone starts talking at the same time, and still, nothing important gets said. Maybe because what really matters almost never fits into a press release. I followed things from a distance. I read enough to know where the process stood, but not enough to drown in speculation. I'd seen this cycle before, in smaller cases. I knew that sooner or later the focus would move away from the event itself and settle on procedures. It always does. The impact fades into the background. Paper becomes the center of attention. That was when I started feeling something that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't relief either. It was more like displacement, as if I were standing a few steps off to the side of a scene I'd taken part in, watching it unfold from the wrong angle, unable to pinpoint the moment I'd stepped out of frame. I wasn't in the hangar anymore. I wasn't on shift. I wasn't sitting in meetings. And yet everything that had happened grew out of decisions made while I still was. A few people checked in on me, not many. Most didn't know what to ask. Others seemed to think it was better not to mention it at all. I never held that against them. Technical disasters make people uncomfortable. They're not like highway accidents or sudden illness. They carry the uneasy suggestion that someone, somewhere, might have acted differently. I answered the same way every time. Said I was doing okay. Said I was following the developments. Said it was too early to draw conclusions. Neutral language. Safe ground. The kind of answers that don't trap you later. I probably learned to speak that way on the job, where a poorly chosen word can turn into a problem weeks down the line. As the days went by, the coverage thinned out. That was expected. There's always something else waiting to take its place. Another crisis. Another headline. The crash stopped being daily news and became a reference point, something mentioned now and then when people talked about safety or oversight. That's when the silence really set in. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the absence of questions. Around that time, I started organizing things around the house, not because I had to, but because it gave my hands something to do. Old boxes, outdated paperwork, notebooks filled with notes that no longer meant much to anyone. In one of those boxes, I found maintenance reports from years back, yellowed pages, signatures from people who had long since retired or passed on, handwritten comments, rushed, practical, written by someone who needed to record something before moving on to the next task. I spent a long time looking at those papers. There was nothing obviously wrong with them. At least nothing you could easily point to. Everything was dated, signed, filed. The kind of paperwork that gives you the impression that things are under control. And maybe that was exactly what unsettled me. The idea that everything can look orderly while, underneath, decisions are quietly being pushed forward. I wasn't reading them to hunt for mistakes. I wasn't trying to clear myself or condemn myself. I looked at them the way you look at old photographs, recognizing the setting, remembering the moment, trying to understand why it all felt normal back then, because it did. It truly did. That was also when I received the first more direct, official contact, not a summons, just a notice saying that at some point they might need further clarification. The language was careful, polite, no accusations. A system that knows how to protect itself, avoids assigning blame until it has to. It didn't keep me awake at night. What kept me awake were the small things. A detail remembered at the wrong hour. A procedure that had once seemed routine and now carried a different weight. Not because it had been wrong, but because it might have been right at the edge of what was allowed. And edges are strange. You don't see them clearly until you've crossed them. At night, when the house was quiet, I found myself thinking less about the crash and more about the time leading up to it. Not the final days, but months, sometimes years before. How often someone said, "We'll keep an eye on it." How often I thought the same. Not out of carelessness, out of adaptation, because real work is adaptation. No operation runs exactly the way the manual says it should. Anyone who's spent enough time in the field learns that early. The question is what you do with that understanding. At the time, I didn't have an answer, just a growing sense that the accident hadn't started on the day of the flight. It had started long before that, in decisions spread thin over time, in small allowances too quiet to draw attention. And the silence that followed only made that clearer. When I was finally called in for a more formal conversation, it wasn't in some dim office or distant building. It was an ordinary room, with an ordinary table and ordinary chairs. Ordinary people asking technical questions, dates, procedures, signatures. I answered calmly. There was no reason to rush. At one point, someone remarked that, on paper, everything appeared to be in order. I agreed, and then carefully, I added that paper doesn't always tell the whole story. No one responded right away. It wasn't a sentence that fit easily into a report. I left that room feeling like everything had been explained, and still unfinished, as if we'd described every component of the machine, but not the habits that had grown around it, the way decisions get postponed, the way acceptable slowly stretches without anyone noticing the exact moment it goes too far. After that, the contact faded again. The process continued at its own measured pace. Officially, my role was already over. Still, the silence lingered. No longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of agreement, but of understanding that some things don't resolve cleanly. The accident would receive a technical explanation. There would be recommendations, small adjustments, maybe minor changes in procedure. None of that would bring anyone back. None of it would erase the feeling that the problem hadn't been a single failure, but a way of operating built over years. It was in that state of mind that I began, without really noticing, to travel back further in my thoughts. Not to the crash, not even to the weeks before it, but to the time when the work was just work. When the hangar was simply the hangar. When the sound of engines didn't carry extra meaning. That's where I need to go next, because if this story has any purpose at all, it isn't in the moment of impact, but in the calm path that led there, when everything still felt safe enough to keep flying. Before all of this, the airport was just a place things passed through, not one of those glass and steel terminals filled with signs and announcements, but a small, functional airport built more to hold up over time than to impress anyone. 2 main runways, a modest terminal, a hangar that always felt bigger on the inside than it looked from the outside. To people passing through, there was nothing there worth noting. To those of us who worked there, it was an entire world. Operations started early, not because there were so many flights, but because regional aviation demands lead time. A small delay at the beginning of the day spreads like a crack in old glass. Everyone knew that. No one had to say it out loud. People arrived at their hours, did what needed to be done, exchanged few words, and moved on. There was no visible rush, but there was a clear sense of continuity. Things had to keep moving. The planes were old. Not old in the sense of scrap, but old in the sense of having lived a long time. They had passed through other hands, other companies, other circumstances. Some carried the marks of modifications made years earlier, back when certain parts were still available, when certain procedures were different. None of this was a secret. It was part of the reality of regional aviation. Anyone expecting a brand new fleet was in the wrong place. The hangar had its own smell, a mix of fuel, oil, warmed metal, and old dust. To someone not used to it, it was strong. To those of us who spent years inside, it faded into the background. That's where I spent most of my time, watching more than talking, listening for sounds that never show up in manuals. There are noises you learn with your body, not your eyes. The work followed a pattern, routine checks, scheduled maintenance, small adjustments. Nothing heroic. Nothing dramatic. The kind of work that only draws attention when it isn't done. I always liked that. I was never interested in public recognition. What mattered was knowing the plane would leave and be able to come back. That was the measure of a good day. There were rules, of course, plenty of them, thick manuals, constant updates, technical bulletins. I respected all of it, always had. But I also knew, like anyone who stays long enough in the field, that no rule covers every situation. Reality is more inventive than paper, and it's in the space between what's written and what actually happens that experience lives. At the time, that didn't feel like a problem. It felt like the job. People knew each other by name. Turnover was low. Those who came tended to stay. Maybe because there wasn't much room for ambition there. No flashy promotions, no salaries that changed your life. What there was stability, routine, and a quiet pride in keeping something running far from the spotlight. For most of us, that was enough. Pilots arrived early, stopped by the hangar, exchanged a few words. They asked how the aircraft was doing, listened to the answer, and moved on. There was no distrust there. There was trust built over time. When you work with the same people for years, you learn to read tone, pauses, gestures. A simple, "It's good," isn't just a sentence. It carries context. I never liked saying more than necessary. If something was out of line, I said it. If it wasn't, I said that too. There was no benefit in hiding problems. Airplanes don't forgive pride. Everyone knew that. What perhaps went unnoticed was how the definition of normal slowly adjusts over time. The manager showed up mostly to check reports, not to watch the work itself, not out of indifference, but because that was his role. Numbers, schedules, costs. He didn't know the mechanical details, and he never pretended to. The relationship was clear. We made sure procedures were followed. He made sure operations kept running. As long as that held, there was no conflict. Manuals were always close at hand. Some pages were worn thin from use. Others were barely touched. Updates arrived regularly, bringing new limits, new recommendations. Applying them to the reality of the fleet wasn't always straightforward. Sometimes an update felt written for an aircraft that no longer existed there. In those moments, we did what we'd always done. We interpreted. Interpreting isn't ignoring, it's adapting. At least that's how it felt. The airport had its own sounds. Engines starting before dawn, metal echoing inside the hangar. Radios crackling with information only familiar ears catch right away. It was a rhythm that didn't need explaining. You stepped into it, or you didn't belong. Outside of work, life was simple. I went home at roughly the same time every day, ate early, woke up early. There wasn't much room for improvisation. Maybe that's why I felt comfortable improvising at work when it was necessary. That was where reality demanded flexibility. Looking back now, with everything that came later, it's easy to imagine there were clear warnings, obvious signs, moments when someone could have stopped everything and said it had gone far enough. But the truth is, back then, nothing felt urgent. There were problems. There always are. But they were known, monitored, kept within what was considered acceptable. And acceptable is a slippery word. It doesn't mean perfect. It means sufficient. Flights went out, planes came back. Passengers complained about delays, not technical failures. Statistics stayed within expectations. Nothing suggested that something major was waiting around the corner, at least not in the way people imagine disasters, with flashing warnings and dramatic decisions. Reality was much quieter. There were days when I ran my hand along the fuselage out of habit, feeling temperature, noticing small vibrations. Not because I suspected anything specific, but because that's how I'd always worked. Direct contact with the machine told me more than any screen. I trusted that. I always had. If someone had asked me then whether that world was safe, I would have said yes, without hesitation. Safe in the way regional aviation has always been. Safe within real conditions, not ideal ones. Safe enough to keep going. That's what makes it harder to accept afterward. There was no sense of imminent danger. No fear. There was work being done, decisions being made, days stacking quietly on top of one another. When tragedy came, it didn't find a negligent environment. It found one tired of constant adaptation, but that was still ahead. At that time, the airport kept running the way it always had. The hangar opened early. Planes took off. People went home at the end of the day with the calm feeling of having done their part, and I was just one more person there, doing what I'd always done, believing it was enough. That was the world the story truly started in, not with a loud mistake, but with a normality stretched just long enough that no one thought to question it. No one wakes up one morning and decides to break rules. At least no one who lasts very long in a place like that. What usually happens is something quieter. The rule arrives too late, or it arrives written for a situation that no longer exists. And then the system, without ever calling it that, teaches you how to work around it. That was our case. It didn't start with a meeting or a memo announcing that things would now be done differently. It happened gradually, almost invisibly, built in the space between a new manual update and the reality of a fleet that had accumulated too much history to fit neatly on paper. The manuals changed often. New recommendations, new limits, new ways of measuring wear. On their own, those changes weren't the problem. The problem started when they landed on airplanes that had never been designed with those rules in mind. Aircraft built in another decade, for another kind of operation, another pace, another maintenance philosophy. On paper, the solution was simple: adapt the fleet or take it out of service. In practice, that meant costs the company couldn't absorb all at once. It meant canceled flights, abandoned routes, people losing jobs. No one said that out loud, but everyone understood it. The system didn't need to apply pressure directly. Reality did that work on its own. That's how certain procedures began to be interpreted more flexibly. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden. Everything recorded in a way that passed inspection. But there was a clear difference between following the letter of the rule and honoring its spirit, and that difference was where experience stepped in. I'd been there long enough to remember when some of those rules didn't even exist. I remembered how we worked before, what held up, what didn't. When a new limit showed up in the manual, I didn't see it as an absolute line. I saw it as guidance, written for an ideal scenario. And our scenario was never ideal. It was functional. That distinction felt reasonable. It was how everyone thought, not just us, but operations like ours everywhere. Regional aviation has always lived in that in-between space, far from cutting-edge technology and too close to the daily need to keep things moving. The manager trusted the technical crew. He had to. He didn't have the knowledge to question every decision, nor the time to follow every detail. His job was to make sure the reports were clean, the numbers lined up, the audits didn't flag serious issues. As long as that held, the system was considered healthy, and it was, at least on the surface. There were periodic meetings, of course, discussions about costs, timelines, efficiency, never about imminent risk. Risk was treated as something abstract, statistical, something measured in annual reports, not felt on the hangar floor. The real risk, the kind you sense in your body, gets diluted by repetition. When something happens 100 times without consequence, it starts to feel safe by definition. That environment taught us to trust our own reading of the machine more than the cold language of the manual. Not out of arrogance, but out of professional survival. The manual didn't listen to the airplane. We did. There were specific cases that showed this clearly. A certain component, for example, had a conservatively defined service limit. On paper, once it reached that number, it was supposed to be replaced. In practice, we knew it could go longer, not by guesswork, but by observation built over years. Replacing it exactly when the manual said would have grounded half the fleet in short order. So we inspected more often, took extra measurements, monitored performance closely, everything documented, everything within what was considered reasonable, and it worked for a long time. The problem is that when something works repeatedly, it stops being seen as an exception and starts being treated as a method. The workaround stops feeling like a workaround. It becomes standard practice, and when someone new arrives, They learned that method as if it were the normal way of doing things. No one ever stopped to say, "We're doing this because we don't have a better option." The context faded. The practice stayed. I remember informal conversations in the hangar, usually late in the shift, when fatigue makes people more honest, comments about how certain requirements didn't make sense for that kind of aircraft, jokes about manuals written by people who'd never spent a full night trying to fix a problem with whatever tools were on hand. None of that felt dangerous. It felt like culture. And culture is powerful. It teaches without explaining. New people learn by watching. They learn what's valued, what's tolerated, what's ignored. They learn quickly that stopping an operation requires a strong justification, but keeping it going only requires that nothing go wrong. As long as nothing went wrong, the system felt confirmed. External inspections happened. Auditors came through, reviewed documents, asked questions. We answered calmly. There were no lies. There were interpretations, and interpretations are hard to challenge when the results are there. Planes flying, acceptable statistics, no recent history of serious incidents. That absence of negative events reinforced confidence. Every successful flight became a quiet validation of how things were being done. Few people realize how dangerous repeated success can be. It creates a sense of immunity, as if accumulated experience can offset any structural limitation. I believed that. I won't pretend otherwise. I believed it because I'd seen it work. Because I'd never seen a plane leave that hangar and not come back. Because when something felt off, we dealt with it. We didn't knowingly push serious problems forward. What we pushed were limits. And limits pushed a little at a time don't look like they're moving. At some level I felt that. Not clearly, not in a way I could put into words, but as an occasional unease. A sense that we were always working very close to what was acceptable. But a limit that's never crossed stops being frightening. Over time, some procedures started to feel almost ceremonial, something done to satisfy an external requirement, not because it truly changed how the work was carried out. Forms filled out, measurements attached, documents filed away. The real work happened before and after the paperwork. That split wasn't seen as a moral failure. It was seen as necessary adaptation. People who'd never had to adapt, we thought, didn't understand how things worked outside the page. Time added its own quiet pressure. Flights had schedules, passengers waited, connections depended on departures. Canceling a flight isn't just a technical call. It's operational, financial, human. It means people miss commitments. The company loses money. Crews work double the next day. All of that weighs on a decision, even when no one says it out loud. No one ever ordered me to clear an unsafe aircraft, not once. That matters. The system doesn't operate through blunt commands. It creates an environment where the correct decision on paper feels disproportionate in practice, where delaying or canceling looks excessive next to a problem that, in lived experience, has never led to anything serious. That's where responsibility starts to slip. It doesn't disappear. It spreads out. It gets diluted across procedures, interpretations, precedents. When something finally goes wrong, everyone can point to some part of the process and say they did what was expected. The problem is that what's expected had already been shaped by years of workaround. I didn't see myself as part of a broken system. I saw myself as part of a resilient one, a system that survived because it knew where it could bend without breaking. That story made sense. It explained the results. It gave the team cohesion. Only later did I realize that resilience and fragility sometimes grow together. The more a system learns to absorb stress, the closer it gets to the moment when it can't absorb anymore. Back then, that wasn't clear yet. The aircraft that would eventually go down had already been part of the fleet long enough to be considered familiar. Nothing about it stood out in isolation. No glaring defect. just a collection of small particularities, all recorded, all monitored, a history that demanded more attention than others, but never crossed established limits. Within our way of working, that meant it was trustworthy. Maybe it needed more care, more hangar time, more inspections, but trustworthy. At least that's how we saw it. The system taught us that, not through doctrine, but through repetition. Day after day, flight after flight, maintenance after maintenance. The manual said one thing, experience said another, and we learned to walk between the two, not as rebels, but as professionals trying to keep something complex running in a world that doesn't wait. Looking at it now, I see that the biggest problem wasn't ignoring rules, but believing we knew exactly how far they could be bent without consequence, believing that recent success was enough insurance for the future, believing the system would always give us a clear warning before failing for good. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It was taught by the environment, by repetition, by the quiet years when nothing serious happened. And inside that lesson, we kept working, convinced we were doing the best we could under the circumstances. The warning was still ahead. At that point, all we had was a system that seemed to work too well to interrupt. The first warning didn't arrive as an alarm. There were no sirens, no emergency meetings, no one running through the hangar with a grave look on their face. It came the way most real warnings do, sideways, mentioned in passing, in a context that didn't seem to demand immediate attention. I heard about the incident on an ordinary morning, while reviewing a report that had nothing to do with it. Someone mentioned, almost the way you mention the weather, that an aircraft of the same model had run into trouble in another region. Nothing too serious, they said. An incident, not an accident. The word was chosen carefully, the way it always is. Incident suggests control. It suggests something went wrong, but not enough to fall apart. At the time, I just looked up and asked where it had happened. I heard the name of the city, far enough away not to feel close, but familiar enough not to be irrelevant. It wasn't just anywhere. It was an operation like ours, with a similar fleet, similar constraints, that registered. Even if no one said it out loud, the comment ended there. Work went on. Tools were picked up again. Checklists were filled out. Voices blended back into the sound of the hangar. But something had already shifted. Quietly. A detail out of place tends to grow when you pretend you didn't notice it. Later that day, I looked for more information. Not out of anxiety, but out of habit. I've always believed that when something happens somewhere else, the least you can do is understand why. The first reports were vague. They talked about a temporary loss of control, about unexpected behavior in a system that, on paper, was operating within parameters. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that called for immediate action. Still, as I read, an uncomfortable feeling started to form. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Some of the technical descriptions matched things I'd already seen, discussed, dealt with. Small anomalies that had never turned into anything bigger. Adjustments made based on accumulated experience. Decisions taken because, up to that point, they had always worked, the kind of thing you mentally file away as a known characteristic. The preliminary report pointed to human factors. That phrase always shows up early. It works as a temporary explanation, a way to frame the unexplainable while time is bought. Human factors is a wide umbrella. A lot fits underneath it. At that moment, I didn't disagree with the conclusion. I didn't fully agree either. I just felt it didn't tell the whole story. But that by itself wasn't new. Reports rarely tell the whole story. They tell what can be said at that stage. I mentioned the incident to 2 other colleagues at different times. Quick conversations, no dramatics. I asked if they'd heard about it, what they thought. The responses were similar. One said it seemed isolated. Another pointed out that the model had its quirks, but nothing outside expectations. No one sounded alarmed. Neither did I. What did change, though, was the way I started to look at certain things. Not because anything had suddenly gotten worse, but because the context had shifted. Once you know something went wrong somewhere else, you see the same setup with different eyes. A few days later, more information came in, still preliminary, still incomplete, but enough to sketch a clearer sequence of events, a combination of conditions that, on their own, wouldn't seem critical. Together they led to a situation that was hard to recover from. None of it was completely unfamiliar. I remember closing the document and standing there for a few moments, staring at the hangar floor. Not dramatically, more like someone trying to reorganize his thoughts before moving on. I wasn't thinking about a specific aircraft then. I was thinking about patterns. Patterns are dangerous because they create comfort. When you recognize one, you tend to trust it. But they're also useful because they help you anticipate trouble. The difficulty is knowing when a pattern has stopped being reliable. The system responded the way it always does. A brief internal notice went out, saying the incident was being monitored, and that for now, there was no recommendation to change procedures. Everything remained in accordance with the manual. Nothing needed to be done differently. Messages like that are meant to reassure. And in a way, they did. If there was no official indication of a problem, there was no reason to alter routine. Still, I started paying closer attention to certain details, not because anyone told me to, but because experience tells you to do that when something slips out of the ordinary. Even slightly. It wasn't paranoia, just care. The aircraft that would later crash wasn't at the center of my thoughts. Yet, it was just one among others, though I knew it demanded more attention than most. Its history was well known. Nothing new there. What was new was the context that history now lived in. As weeks passed, most people stopped thinking about the incident altogether. That's how it goes. When there are no immediate consequences, attention fades. Other problems come up. Other demands take over. The incident became an occasional reference in technical conversations, but without emotional weight. For me, it stayed like an irritating footnote, something I couldn't fully dismiss, even though I didn't know what to do with it. There was no clear action to take, no new procedure, just the awareness that something similar could happen here, under certain conditions. I didn't escalate that concern. I didn't call a meeting. I didn't write a special report. Not because I wanted to hide anything, but because there was no solid ground to stand on. Raising alarms without technical backing is usually seen as overreaction, and overreaction in that environment was frowned upon. It disrupts operations, creates noise, breeds mistrust. The system teaches you early on to speak only when you're sure. The problem is that certainty in complex systems tends to arrive too late. There was one moment, weeks later, when the incident resurfaced in my mind with more force. I was overseeing routine maintenance when I noticed a behavior I'd seen before, but that morning it felt different. Not worse, necessarily, just different enough to stand out. I stopped and watched more carefully, took extra measurements, compared them with previous data. Everything stayed within accepted limits. There was no technical reason to stop the operation. Still, I logged it mentally, not as a fault, but as a variation. Those variations are the kind of thing that accumulate in a professional's experience. They don't turn into statistics. They don't show up on charts, but they influence future decisions, even if only subconsciously. When the aircraft returned to service, nothing happened. The flight went normally. Passengers got off and went on with their lives. Another quiet validation of the system. This is the hardest thing to explain to people who've never worked in environments like this. Every time a potentially problematic situation ends without consequence, it becomes less problematic in collective perception. Not because the risk is gone, but because it didn't materialize. And the human brain is terrible at dealing with dangers that don't confirm themselves. So the external incident drifted further into the background of operational memory, not forgot but shelved. Like so many things that once seemed important and then dissolved into routine, until more details began to surface. Months later, when the investigation of that incident was further along, Some preliminary conclusions started circulating, not officially, but through professional channels, technical forums, quiet conversations between people in the field. Nothing that could be cited formally, but enough to sharpen the picture. It hadn't been a single failure. It had been a sequence, a chain of reasonable decisions that, together, led to a critical situation. There was no sabotage, no gross negligence. There was too much normality. That word started bothering me again. Normality. I began to see how many of the things described in that report mirrored parts of our own routine. Not identical, but close enough to be uncomfortable. The kind of closeness you can't completely ignore. Still, nothing changed officially. No new directives, no added restrictions. The system once again opted for minimal adjustments. Pay closer attention. Monitor continuously. Review existing procedures. All things we were already doing. That lack of clear change had a curious effect. It kept everything the same, but it increased individual responsibility. If something happened from that point on, it wouldn't be possible to claim total surprise. The warning had been there, even if indirectly. I felt that, not as immediate pressure, but as a new layer of awareness. A quiet alert that settled somewhere in the back of my mind. It didn't interfere with my work, but it didn't go away either. Some days I managed to forget it entirely. Other days it surfaced more clearly, especially when I dealt with that specific aircraft, or with situations that required a more flexible reading of the manual. In those moments, I wondered if we were slowly entering the same kind of sequence that had led to the external incident, not because we were making worse decisions, but because the conditions were similar enough to matter. Still, operations continued. Flights went out. Statistics remained acceptable. Nothing reinforced the need for a drastic change. And without that external push, systems tend to keep doing what they're already doing. The warning had come, not as an order, but as a possibility. What to do with it wasn't clear. And when there's no clarity, the most common response is to move forward, trusting that accumulated experience will be enough to keep the worst from happening. I trusted that too, not blindly, but I trusted it, because that's what years in that environment had taught me to do. Trust the balance between what's written and what works. Trust that if something were truly wrong, there would be a stronger, clearer signal, something impossible to ignore. I believed that signal hadn't arrived yet. It was closer than I thought. The new guys showed up in early fall, when operations were still steady, but the heat had finally eased inside the hangar. I remember that detail because it was one of the few times someone new arrived without carrying that usual sense of urgency. He didn't seem anxious. He seemed prepared, maybe too prepared, fresh out of training, certifications in order, everything neatly lined up. He spoke about systems with precision, quoted procedures almost from memory, used the right language for every situation, polite, attentive, respectful. He didn't come in trying to change anything. He came in wanting to learn, or at least that's how it looked. I watched from a distance at first. I always do. New people need space to show how they work before you decide what they are. And he worked well, followed checklists to the letter, verified every step, never skipped a line, never improvised. From the outside, it was exactly what you'd want. From the inside, it was different, not wrong, just different, because it didn't fully reflect the reality of that hangar. He was doing everything by the book. The problem was that the book didn't know that fleet, or that hangar, or the adjustments that had accumulated over the years. The book described a theoretical airplane. We dealt with a real one. At first, it caused no friction at all. If anything, his presence brought a certain relief. Having someone who follows procedure that closely creates a feeling of safety. It gives the impression that everything is being done the right way. And technically, it was. The problem isn't following the manual. It never was. The problem is when the manual becomes the only lens you use to see the machine. That difference became clearer during one of the first, longer maintenance jobs we did together. It was a routine task, something we'd done dozens of times. The procedure laid out a specific sequence of checks. He followed each one, marked every item, confirmed everything carefully. At one point, I suggested we look at a detail that wasn't explicitly listed on the checklist, but that experience had taught us was worth watching. He looked at the paper, then at the aircraft, then back at me. He didn't argue. He just asked whether it was necessary, since it wasn't part of the procedure. I explained calmly that kind of observation often helps catch problems before they become visible. He listened, nodded, and did the check. Everything was fine, no issue. We moved on. But that moment stayed with me, not as criticism of him, but as a clear sign of a difference in training. For him, anything not written down needed justification. For me, what wasn't written down was often where experience showed itself. That difference never turned into open conflict. We never argued. There was never a confrontation, but it was there, sitting quietly between us. And it became more noticeable as he gained confidence and independence. Over time, he started handling tasks on his own. Always correct, always methodical. The reports he filled out were flawless. Hard to find a single fault. If someone from the outside had looked only at his paperwork, they would have had complete confidence in the operation. And maybe that was what unsettled me most, because I knew that level of adherence to paper didn't eliminate the risks the paper couldn't describe. It just made them invisible. The manager liked him. He didn't say it outright, but it was obvious. A young professional, disciplined, delivering everything as expected, without creating exceptions. For management, that's gold. Someone who reduces noise, who doesn't complicate things, who turns operations into something predictable. In meetings, when his name came up, it was always in a positive tone. Follows procedure, by the book, brings safety. None of that was wrong, but I also knew that kind of safety was partial. It depended on the assumption that the manual still accurately described reality. The new guy respected me. That was clear, too. He asked questions when he had doubts. He listened. He never treated me like someone outdated. On the contrary, he saw me as a reference for experience. But there was an invisible line. He respected my years, but trusted the official text more. That became especially clear when we started working more closely on the aircraft that would later go down. It was a familiar airplane, as I've said, demanded constant attention, but had never shown a major failure. Its history was fully documented. To anyone reading the records, it looked like just another aircraft with heavy maintenance needs. Nothing out of the ordinary. During one of the inspections, the new guy pointed out that all parameters were within established limits. He said it calmly, almost with relief. For him, that closed the matter. Within limits meant acceptable. Acceptable meant safe. I agreed with the technical reading. There was nothing that justified grounding the aircraft at that point. Still, I asked him to watch a specific behavior during testing, something subtle, hard to quantify, but that I'd noticed before. He watched, confirmed there was a slight variation, then went back to the paper. The variation was within acceptable limits, so it wasn't a problem. That was the first time I felt a different kind of weight in that difference between us. Not because he was wrong. Technically, he wasn't. But because if something happened, the system would already have its answer ready. Procedure was followed. And those who follow procedure rarely carry the final burden. That realization landed uncomfortably. I saw that in the event of a problem, the official narrative would be simple. The young technician followed the manual. The manager followed the report. Operations followed protocol. If something went wrong, the question would be, why didn't someone stop it earlier? And that question would land, inevitably, on whoever had enough experience to have noticed. On me. The new guy wasn't to blame for that. He was doing exactly what he'd been taught. That's how the system protects itself, by training people to be flawless on paper. It ensures that responsibility ultimately falls on those who step beyond it. That dynamic wasn't explicit. It wasn't written anywhere, but it was real. Over time, I noticed I was changing my own behavior around him, not out of insecurity, but awareness. I chose my words more carefully. I justified any suggestion outside the procedure more thoroughly. I didn't want to put him in a difficult position, and I didn't want to sound like someone who ignored rules. At the same time, I knew there were things the paper simply couldn't capture, and that tension started to build. There was one afternoon I can't get out of my head. We were finishing a final check before clearing a flight. Everything indicated the aircraft was fit to fly. The checklist was complete. The report, clean. The new guy closed the folder with the calm confidence of someone who had done good work. I stayed near the aircraft a few minutes longer, not because there was something specific to do, but because I needed to observe. I walked around it, listened. I didn't find anything concrete, just a diffuse sense that this aircraft demanded more respect than the paper suggested. It wasn't fear, it was caution. I looked at the new guy, waiting for my confirmation. He trusted me. That much was clear, but he also trusted what was written. And at that moment, what was written said everything was fine. I could have asked for more time. I could have ordered an additional check, even without a formal justification. But that would have had consequences. A delayed flight. A different report. Questions. Explanations. All for something I couldn't prove technically. And there it was, the silent dilemma. Act on a perception that's hard to justify, or stay within the safety of the paper. That day, we stayed with the paper. The flight went out without incident. Another confirmation, another reason to believe I'd been overly cautious. Outcomes like that slowly erode the will to question. Every success reinforces the idea that the system is right. The new guy left that day more confident. I left with more silence. Over time, his presence came to represent more than just a new co-worker. He embodied the system as it wanted to be seen, clean, organized, predictable, and I embodied the uncomfortable reminder that, in practice, things had never been that simple. There was no antagonism between us, just a mismatch of timing. He represented the institutional future. I carried the operational past. The two coexisted, but never fully merged, and without fully realizing it, I began to understand something that would only become clear much later. If an accident came, he wouldn't be held responsible. Neither would the manager. Neither would the manual. The system would find a technical explanation, but conscience doesn't follow protocol. That understanding didn't lead to an immediate decision. It didn't cause a rupture. It just settled in quietly, like so many other things in that place. And silence, as I would learn, is also a form of choice. Outside the hangar, my life wasn't anything remarkable. It never had been. Maybe that's why it blended so easily with the work. There were no sharp contrasts, no clean breaks between what I did during the day and what waited for me at home. Everything followed the same logic. Keep things running as long as you can, with what you have. The house was old. Not old enough to be a problem, but old enough to require constant attention. Small things always needed fixing. A door that didn't close quite right. A faucet that dripped now and then. A heater that worked better if you gave it a few extra minutes before asking too much of it. None of that bothered me. I handled those things the same way I handled airplanes, by watching, adjusting, and delaying replacement as long as it still made sense. I lived alone at the time. I'd been married years earlier, but that chapter had ended without drama. There wasn't a single event that broke it apart. It wore down slowly. Incompatible schedules, accumulated fatigue, conversations that kept getting postponed. By the time we realized it, there was nothing left to insist on. No fight, just acceptance. After that, life simplified. Work, home, a few social obligations here and there. Nothing that demanded major emotional decisions. Maybe that, too, shaped how I dealt with things. When life doesn't force urgent choices, you get used to postponing resolutions. There was one person, though, who was part of my daily life in a steady way, a close relative, older, whose health wasn't what it used to be, not someone dramatically ill, someone operating near the edge of what was acceptable, much like so many things around me. They needed monitoring, regular care, attention to small signs that, if ignored, could grow into bigger problems. I helped where I could. Appointments, medication, adjustments to routine, always in a practical way, without excess. We never had a clear conversation about the future, about how long that arrangement would hold. Those conversations are uncomfortable, and I'd always been good at postponing discomfort. Most of the time, things worked. Some days were harder, some easier. When something slipped a bit, we adjusted, changed schedules, paid closer attention. There never seemed to be a right moment for definitive decisions. It always felt a little too early. That pattern felt natural to me. I rarely questioned it. To my mind, it was responsibility, being present, keeping things stable, avoiding abrupt change. I never thought of myself as someone who avoids problems. I thought of myself as someone who believes big problems usually start too small to justify drastic action. In the evenings, after work, I often sat on the porch for a few minutes before going inside. It wasn't a conscious habit, just a pause between two spaces. Sometimes I sat in silence, listening to distant sounds, watching the sky change color. Planes passed too high to see, leaving only a brief noise that the rest of the world quickly absorbed. In those moments, work rarely came to mind directly. I didn't think about procedures or reports. I thought about the next day, about things that still needed tending, about what could be held together a little longer before needing real change. There were small signs of personal wear, too, the kind you prefer not to name. A tiredness that lingered longer than it used to, attention slipping on simple details now and then. Nothing alarming, nothing that justified concern, just the kind of thing you notice, file away, and move on from. I was never one to dramatize getting older. I always thought that was unhelpful. Bodies change, minds adjust, life continues. What mattered was staying useful, staying functional within what was expected. That idea of functioning had always been central for me. Functioning doesn't mean perfect. It means fulfilling your basic role without causing trouble. At home, at work, in relationships, as long as things functioned, I felt at ease. The trouble with that logic is the blind spot it creates. It makes you notice seriousness only when something stops functioning altogether. Until then, everything feels manageable. There was one moment, seemingly trivial, that later took on a strange place in my memory. It happened at home, on an ordinary night. Something didn't work the way it should. A simple piece of equipment I'd fixed before. This time, the fix didn't take right away. I had to improvise more than usual, adjust beyond what I considered ideal. In the end, it worked like it always did, but it was clear the solution had a shelf life. It wasn't meant to last. I knew that. I told myself that at some point, I'd need to replace the part, do something more permanent. Just not that night. That night, it only needed to function. That thought brought a momentary sense of relief and a quiet recognition. I was surrounded by temporary solutions that had become permanent simply because there was never a right moment to end them. At work, I did something similar. Not in the same way, of course, but the logic was the same. Keep things running. Watch for signs. Step in only when something crossed a clear line. The problem is that clear lines rarely announce themselves ahead of time. I didn't consciously connect these dots. I didn't tell myself that my personal life was shaping my professional judgment, but both moved to the same rhythm. Both rested on the belief that as long as nothing had broken completely, there was no real urgency. Some people handle life differently. They prefer quick decisions, clean cuts, abrupt change. I never did. I always believed sudden shifts created more problems than they solved. Maybe that's true in many cases, maybe not in all. There were days I came home especially tired, not physically, but mentally. Days when work demanded more interpretation, more judgment. more decisions that didn't fit neatly into the manual. On those days, the idea of "I'll deal with it later" felt especially comforting. It creates the illusion of control without demanding immediate action. Over time, that habit hardens. It becomes a way of living. You learn to coexist with loose ends, to organize priorities, so the urgent always crowds out the important. And since almost nothing presents itself as truly urgent, everything gets stacked somewhere in the back of the mind. The relative I was caring for lived the same way. Appointments postponed when symptoms eased, adjustments made based on how they felt that day, not on ideal recommendations, not out of neglect, but pragmatism. Life rarely fits the perfect plan. When things worsened, we reacted. When they improved, we relaxed. That back and forth created the sense that there was always time. Time to observe, time to decide, time to correct, time that felt renewable. Looking back, I see how misleading that was. Though time doesn't accumulate, it moves on, whether you manage it or not. At the time, though, it wasn't clear. What was clear was that everything was still standing. The house, the routine, the work, the people around me. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing demanded a final break. That normality, held together by constant small adjustments, gave me a strange sense of competence. I felt capable of handling complex situations, of maintaining balance under imperfect conditions. That confidence didn't come from arrogance. It came from repetition. When you solve the same kind of problem over and over, you start believing there will always be another solution available. The danger in that belief is that it leaves no room for a problem that can't be adjusted away. I didn't think about that then. I thought about the next day, the next task, the next fix. I thought about how to keep things moving without creating unnecessary waves, and without realizing it, I carried that same logic into the hangar. The same patience with stretched limits, the same trust that if something truly serious were about to happen, there would be a stronger, clearer signal, something impossible to ignore. That belief stayed with me every day, quiet, comfortable. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt mature, responsible, experienced. Only later did I understand that it was also a habit of postponement. And postponement, when it becomes a way of life, can cost more than you expect. But at that point, everything was still functioning, and as long as it did, I kept going, convinced there was still time. There comes a moment when things stop being general and start having a name. Up to that point, everything had been system, pattern, context. But at some point, risk concentrates. It chooses a place to land. In our case, it chose a specific aircraft. It wasn't a conscious decision. No notice came saying, "This is the one." It was quieter than that, a series of small coincidences that, together, narrowed the focus. That aircraft began showing up more often in my routine, not because it had suddenly gotten worse, but because it demanded more attention than the others. It always had. The difference was that now I was paying closer attention. It was an airplane that had been through a lot. Route changes, operational adjustments, modifications made over the years to keep it useful. All documented, all monitored. Its history was long, but not alarming. If you looked at the data alone, it was an example of how steady maintenance can extend the life of a machine. And maybe that was exactly what made it dangerous. The longer something is kept operating despite natural wear, the harder it becomes to identify the exact point where it stops being reliable. There's no clear line. There's a gray zone that expands gradually. I knew that aircraft too well. I knew how it behaved under different conditions, which sounds were normal, which variations deserved attention. Nothing about it frightened me in isolation. The problem was the combination. Time was a factor, too. The flight schedule was tight. A few aircraft were out of service for unrelated reasons. Our margin for maneuver was thinner than ideal. Not critical, but far from comfortable. The manager mentioned that in a short meeting. Without dramatizing it, he just laid out the number. The fleet needed to operate efficiently. Cancellations created a chain reaction. None of that was new. Regional aviation has always worked near the edge of what's possible. In that context, the aircraft was assigned more frequently. It was available. On paper, it was airworthy. And in practice, it had been doing its job. The new guy took part in the last maintenance checks before the flight that would later sit at the center of everything. He did his work with the same rigor as always. Checklists complete, measurements within limits, clean reports. There was no flaw in what he did, and that made any challenge harder. During one of the final inspections, I stayed close. Not because I distrusted him, but because I felt that aircraft deserved extra attention. We ran additional tests, observed behavior, compared data with previous records. Everything indicated that, while it was close to the acceptable limit, it was still within it. That word bothered me again. Within. Within what? Within limits defined when. For which context? For which history? Those questions had no objective answers. And questions without objective answers don't sit well in environments that demand clear decisions. The flight itself started taking shape on the scheduling board well in advance. It wasn't a special flight. It was a familiar route with regular passengers. People who took that trip, often ordinary people, going back and forth for ordinary reasons. That matters, even when no one says it. When you know the kind of people who board that aircraft, the decision stops being purely technical, not because you think about each individual, but because the flight stops being abstract. It gains possible faces. I knew the aircraft was going to fly. That was never really the question. The question was whether there was anything that justified stopping it. And justify is the key word. Feeling isn't enough. You have to prove it, and I had no proof. In the days leading up to the flight, I found myself thinking again about the external incident, about the similarities, about the technical descriptions, about how certain sequences only make sense after they've happened. Before that, they seem too unlikely to justify drastic action. Once again, the system didn't point to anything outside expectations. No new bulletins, no additional recommendations. Officially, nothing had changed. And when nothing changes officially, any decision outside the norm starts to look personal. That personalization of decision-making is one of the hardest things to deal with in complex environments, because it shifts responsibility from the collective to the individual, and individuals hesitate, not out of fear, but out of awareness of consequences. I started asking myself whether I was overthinking it, whether I was projecting risk, where statistically it remained low. After all, how many flights had that aircraft completed without issue? How many times had similar situations been resolved without incident? Those questions have weight. They're rational, and most of the time, they're right. The new guy saw no reason for concern, and why would he? Everything was clear to him. The paperwork said it was acceptable. The system confirmed it. There was no recent history of serious failure associated with that aircraft. He didn't have the background to feel the discomfort I felt. And honestly, I didn't know if that discomfort alone justified anything concrete. The manager maintained his usual posture. He asked whether everything was within parameters. He received affirmative answers. We moved on. He didn't push further. He didn't need to. The system itself already leaned toward continuity. One afternoon, I stayed alone in the hangar with that aircraft longer than necessary, not because there was something specific to do, but because I needed to observe. I walked around it, touched the fuselage, listened for sounds that only show up when the place is quiet. I found nothing I could point to as a clear defect. The problem is that absence of defect isn't the same as absolute safety. It's just absence of evidence. That afternoon, I seriously considered recommending a deeper intervention, something that would have grounded the aircraft longer, that would have had direct impact on scheduling. There would have been questions, and I would have had to answer them with something difficult to articulate. I asked myself whether I was ready to carry that, not just professionally, but emotionally, because decisions like that isolate you. They make you the problem, even when you're trying to prevent one. In the end, I did nothing that day, not because I consciously chose inaction, but because I couldn't find firm ground to act on. All I had were sensations, recognized patterns, accumulated unease. That's rarely enough in systems that demand objective justification. The aircraft was cleared. The flight hadn't happened yet. There was still time, but that time was tight. I felt it clearly, not as a countdown, but as a narrowing of decision space. Every day that passed without change made any future intervention more drastic. The night before the flight, I reviewed the reports once more, read every line carefully. I found no errors, no negligence. What I found was the faithful reflection of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. That realization was, paradoxically, the most unsettling, because if everything was being done correctly, according to rules, parameters, institutional logic, then any future problem couldn't be pinned on a clear deviation. It would be the result of something more diffuse, a sum of acceptable decisions. That thought followed me home that night. I couldn't settle the way I usually did, not because I was panicking, but because a difficult clarity was forming. The clarity that I was facing a choice that didn't present itself as a choice. There was no red button, no alarm. There was only a set of weak signals, hard to assemble into a solid argument, and time moving forward. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The hangar was still quiet. The aircraft waited, silent, the way it always had. Nothing about it suggested urgency. Nothing demanded immediate action. The new guy arrived shortly after, greeted me, opened the documents, reviewed the final items, everything as expected. He didn't sense my tension. Or maybe he did, but had no reason to interpret it as relevant. To him, it was just another work day. The manager showed up later, checked the situation briefly, asked the usual question. The answer was the usual one, within the manual. And in that moment, I understood that the specific aircraft was no longer just an aircraft. It was the meeting point of everything that had come before. The system, the habit of working around limits, the external warning, the new guy, the life of postponement. All of it converged on a decision that officially didn't even need to be made. The aircraft was ready to fly, and I knew that from that point on, whatever happened would stop being just technical. It would be human. The day began like so many others. There was no sign in the sky, no sudden shift in the wind, nothing external that could later be pointed to as a warning that had been ignored. If someone went looking for omens, they wouldn't find any. It was a clear day, operationally ordinary, suitable for flying, and somehow that made everything heavier. I arrived early, before the place fully came to life. I've always liked those first minutes, when the airport is still more of a physical space than a working machine. I walked through the hangar at a familiar pace. The aircraft was there, motionless, silent, the way airplanes always look before they're asked to do their part. There's something misleading about an aircraft sitting on the ground. It gives off a sense of stability, control. You look at it, and everything feels firmly in human hands. It's only later, once it's airborne, that the balance shifts. But in that moment, parked and quiet, it looked like just another object waiting to be cleared. The new guy showed up shortly after, greeted me casually, without noticing anything unusual. There was no reason for him to notice. To him, this was just another flight. He opened the paperwork, reviewed the final items, checked the numbers. Everything followed the familiar script. As he worked, I watched, not the task itself, but the setting around it, the way things were lining up, the way they fit into a normality that no longer reassured me. Every correct procedure felt like one more door closing on any decision outside the standard path. At one point, he commented on how clean the data was for that aircraft. said that despite its long history, everything was well documented. He meant it as a compliment to the system, and he wasn't wrong. The documentation was solid, complete. There were no obvious gaps. I nodded, without adding much. I didn't want to cloud that sense of clarity with doubts I couldn't yet translate into objective terms. The manager arrived later, right on schedule. He didn't linger. Asked the usual question, in the same neutral tone he always used. There was no overt pressure, no direct demand, just the quiet expectation of continuity. Everything within the manual. That question, simple as it sounds, carries enormous weight because it defines the boundaries of decision-making. If the answer is yes, things move forward. If it's no, everything has to be reorganized around that fact. The new guy answered first, as he usually did, confirmed that everything was within parameters, checked, documented. The manager then looked at me, waiting for the final confirmation, not because he doubted the new guy, but out of respect for the informal hierarchy that builds over time. I was the most experienced one there. My word closed the matter. There was a brief pause between the question and my answer. Just a few seconds. To anyone else, it might have looked like hesitation. To me, it felt like a wide space, filled with thoughts that refused to line up neatly. I thought about the external incident, about the aircraft's history, about the variations I'd observed, always acceptable, but persistent. I thought about my life outside the hangar, the habit of postponing, of keeping things going as long as they still functioned. I thought about the new guy, his faith in the paper, the way the system would shield him if something went wrong, and most of all, I thought about what I would need to say to stop that flight. It wouldn't be enough to say, "I'm not comfortable." Comfort isn't a technical criterion. It wouldn't be enough to say, "I think we should take another look." Another look at what, exactly? There was no specific item out of place, no number over the limit, no clear failure. Stopping that flight would mean owning a decision based on subjective experience, and subjective decisions, in tightly regulated environments, are viewed with suspicion. They create precedents that are hard to manage. If I grounded that aircraft without formal justification, I'd have to stand behind it later. In reports, in meetings, in audits. At some point, I'd have to say that I trusted my perception more than the manual. That sentence rarely ends well. At the same time, I knew that if something happened, the manual wouldn't share the burden with me. It would remain intact, protected by its own logic. The one carrying experience also carries the quiet responsibility that comes with it. I looked at the aircraft once more. Nothing about it felt urgent. Nothing shouted danger. Everything was simply close to the edge. And edges are deceptive. As long as you haven't crossed them, they feel safe. I said yes. There was no immediate relief. No sense of duty fulfilled, just continuity. The manager nodded, closed the conversation, moved on to something else. The new guy continued with the final steps. The system absorbed the decision as if it were just another data point. Boarding began later. I didn't follow it closely. I never do, not out of detachment, but because my responsibility ends before that. Once the aircraft is cleared, it belongs to other hands. Still, that morning, I watched from a distance. Not the passengers themselves, but the movement. People boarding, bags being loaded, doors closing, all of it too normal. There was a moment when I considered going back on it, not because new information had appeared, but because time still allowed it. I could have created a delay, asked for an additional check, something vague, without pointing to a clear fault. But actions like that, when they're not backed by something concrete, raise immediate questions. And questions demand answers. I didn't have better answers than the ones already in the reports. Letting the flight proceed was, paradoxically, the simplest and most defensible option within the system. It required fewer explanations, less immediate friction, less noise. The aircraft lifted off without difficulty. I saw it from a distance the same way I'd seen so many others. The takeoff was clean, nothing out of the ordinary. Anyone watching only that moment would have had no reason to worry. That's one of aviation's crueler truths. The critical moment rarely coincides with the moment of decision. Risk moves in time. It accepts the choice now and collects later. After the aircraft departed, I went back to work. There were other tasks, other planes, other demand. The day doesn't stop because one flight leaves. It simply absorbs it as another completed event. Still, I was different, not tense, but alert in a strange way, like I was waiting for something I couldn't quite name. That feeling wasn't new. I'd felt it before, in other situations. Most of the time it faded when nothing happened. Hours later the news arrived, not as an alarm, not all at once. It came fragmented, half-confirmed, passed from one person to another before appearing officially. A problem in flight, lost contact, attempts to reach the crew. Moments like that are confusing by nature. No one knows exactly what's happening, but everyone understands something isn't right. The hangar's atmosphere shifted quickly. Silence returned. Not the reflective kind, but a tense one, filled with sudden interruptions. When confirmation came, it didn't bring shock. It brought weight. The aircraft had gone down. Details were still scarce. A general location, unknown conditions. No immediate information about casualties, but at that moment, it hardly mattered. The word down carried everything. I sat down, not out of physical weakness, but because my body asked me to. I felt a strange coldness, not panic, but recognition, a clear sense that what I'd struggled to name had finally taken shape. The new guy was pale. He looked at the floor, then at me, as if searching for an explanation. I didn't have one to give him. Not then. The manager returned. His posture changed. The administrative neutrality was gone. There was real concern now. Questions started coming. Still disorganized. The system had entered containment mode. I answered when asked. Briefly, factually. There was no space for reflection yet. Only for information. Times. Procedures. Confirmations. Everything that had been done was documented. Everything had been done as expected. And that was the hardest part to accept. There had been no clear mistake that day, no obvious negligence. There had been a decision within allowed bounds, a decision that on its own didn't look wrong. The problem was the sum of everything that came before it. As hours passed and information began to settle, I understood that a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. There was the before, built on stretched normality, and there was the after, filled with questions that don't have clean answers. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I didn't argue. I watched the process begin. I knew it would be long. I knew my name would appear. I knew nothing I said now would change what had already happened. When I was finally cleared to go home that day, the sun was already low. The airport felt like a different place, not physically, but emotionally. Every sound seemed louder, every movement heavier. On the drive home, I kept returning to those few seconds. That simple question, that answer I'd given. Not as immediate regret, but as late analysis, trying to find the exact point where something could have been different. I didn't find one, and that was the hardest realization. Sometimes there isn't a single point. There's just a sequence of acceptable choices that, together, lead to an unacceptable outcome. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was replaying the crash, but because my mind kept circling what came before it, the weak signals, the postponed decisions, the confidence in a system that seemed too solid to fail. The aircraft had gone down. That was the fact. Everything else was only beginning, and I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be just technical anymore. Even if no one said it out loud, everything had become personal. The solitary decision had already been made. Now came the cost. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like a tiredness that doesn't go away with sleep. In the first days, everything was still wrapped in emergency procedures, fragmented communications, people trying to understand what had happened without yet knowing how to ask the right questions. The airport didn't shut down. That's something people often misunderstand. Even after an accident, places like that keep running. Planes continue to land and take off. People keep showing up for work. The world doesn't pause to absorb tragedy. It just creates a compartment for it and moves on. Inside the hangar, the atmosphere had changed, but the work continued. Quieter, more restrained. Conversations cut short before they could wander. Short sentences, no jokes, no raised voices. Everyone seemed aware that any extra word could end up quoted in a report later. The first investigations began quickly. Outside teams started moving through the space, people who weren't part of our daily routine. Clipboards, cameras, carefully framed questions. They looked at the hangar like a scene to be examined. To us, it was still a workplace. That difference alone creates tension. I was formally interviewed a few days later. Nothing dramatic, no accusations, just structured, technical questions, organized in a sequence that made sense on paper. Dates, times, procedures, decisions, everything I'd already answered before, now with more formality. I answered calmly. There was no reason to rush, no reason to defend myself emotionally. Everything that had been done was documented. Everything I could say already existed in logs, records, signatures. The system doesn't like stories. It likes facts. At one point, someone asked whether I'd had any doubts before clearing the flight. The question was asked carefully, almost as if they wished they didn't have to ask it. Doubt is a complicated word. It suggests something subjective, something hard to measure. I told the truth. I said that, like many other times, there had been elements that required attention, but nothing had crossed established limits. I said that, technically, there was no formal justification to stop the operation. No one reacted right away. They wrote it down and moved on to the next question. That's another thing you only learn by going through it. The system doesn't argue with feelings. At best, it records them and keeps going. Emotion doesn't enter technical conclusions, even when it explains human behavior better than any chart. The new guy was interviewed too. I wasn't present, but I knew how it went. He'd followed the manual. There was nothing in his work that could be labeled a failure. That was clear from the beginning. The system needed that clarity. It needed someone who represented perfect adherence to procedure. The manager came next. He answered the way he always had. When asked whether he'd pressured anyone to clear the flight, he said no, and it was true. He never pressured directly. The system doesn't work that way. It creates conditions. As the weeks passed, reports began to take shape. Preliminary versions circulated, still without final conclusions, but already pointing in certain directions. They spoke of a chain of events, of combined factors, of decisions made within accepted limits. That phrase appeared more than once, within accepted limits. It sounded harmless, but it carried everything. There was no moment when someone said, "Here is the mistake." Instead, a narrative formed piece by piece, showing how a series of reasonable choices led to a tragic outcome. That narrative didn't need villains. It needed coherence, and it had it. My name appeared in several places, always tied to roles, responsibilities, technical decisions, never as the sole cause, never as directly at fault, but present enough not to be ignored. I read those drafts with a strange attention, not like someone defending himself, but like someone trying to understand. I wasn't looking for absolution or condemnation. I was looking for meaning. At home, silence took on a different texture. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was the steady presence of something unresolved. I kept my routine, but it felt slightly misaligned. Simple tasks required more effort than before, not because they were hard, but because my mind kept circling the same points. There were moments when I replayed that morning. Not the crash, the before, the manager's question, the new guy's look, that short gap between doubt and answer. Those seconds stretched in memory far beyond their actual length. It wasn't regret in the usual sense. Regret usually comes with the belief that you could have clearly acted differently. What I felt was something else, a sharp awareness that even by doing everything right, the outcome could still be what it was. That realization is hard to live with because it breaks the illusion of control. It says that following rules doesn't guarantee results, that experience doesn't grant immunity, that well-designed systems can still fail in ways no one can stop in time. The system, meanwhile, kept working. Adjustments were discussed, small procedural changes, new recommendations, revised limits. Nothing radical, nothing that fundamentally altered how operations work, just enough to show that something had been learned. Those changes always come after, and they always look reasonable when viewed on their own. The problem is that they never reach back far enough. Over time, it became clear I wouldn't be returning to the hangar. There was no formal dismissal, no disciplinary removal, just a quiet understanding that my cycle there was over. I was close to retirement anyway. The accident simply accelerated what had already been approaching. I didn't resist. There was nothing to argue. Staying would have required a kind of energy I no longer had, and the place itself had changed for me. Every corner now carried an extra layer of meaning. Working there would no longer be just work. On the last day, I walked through the hangar as an employee. I moved slowly. I didn't touch anything. I just watched. People were busy, focused. Life at work went on. The system went on. That's when I realized the accident hadn't broken the machine. It had been absorbed by it. That understanding brought an odd mix of clarity and insignificance. I wasn't the center of the story. I never had been. I was just one part who understood too late how large the machine really was. When I finally stopped working there, time stretched out differently. No fixed schedules, no shifts, no reports. That freedom didn't bring immediate relief. It brought space, and space, when it isn't filled, tends to be occupied by old thoughts. It was during that period that I began, without fully intending to organize everything mentally, not to write a report, not to explain myself to anyone, but to understand. I needed to locate the error, not on paper, but in habit. In the way we learn to trust what's always worked, in how we postpone difficult decisions because they don't seem urgent yet. That understanding didn't bring peace, but it brought coherence. What comes after, I learned, rarely fixes anything. It just rearranges the remains in a way that allows life to continue. The real cost stays with those who lived through the before, and I was one of them. After everything ended, the investigations, the reports, the interviews, the meetings, what remained was a kind of silence I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't the silence of waiting or the awkward quiet that follows something no one knows how to talk about. It was deeper than that. Structural, as if the world had moved on and left behind only what was essential. Days took on a different measure, without shifts, without fixed hours, without the clear line between before and after work. At first it feels like freedom. Later, it feels like too much space, and too much space tends to reveal things routine used to keep in order. I kept waking up early. Even when I didn't have to, my body still followed an old rhythm. I'd make coffee, sit at the table, and stay there for a few minutes without aiming my thoughts anywhere in particular. Sometimes the radio was on, sometimes it wasn't. Planes still passed overhead, usually too high to see. The sound came first, then faded. For most of my life, that sound meant work. Nothing more. After the accident, it gained another layer. It didn't trigger fear. It didn't trigger guilt right away. It became a quiet reminder of how much has to hold together for something that looks simple to happen. People sometimes ask me about what happened. They don't say the crash at first. They say that thing, as if the word itself carries too much weight. I answer politely, briefly. I say it was difficult, that many factors were involved. that the system did what it was designed to do. I don't go into details, not because they're secret, but because they're rarely useful. Technical explanations describe mechanisms. They don't explain what stays with you. What stays doesn't fit into a report. For a long time, I asked myself whether I could have done something differently. That question comes naturally, almost automatically, but the more I returned to the facts, the less clear the question became. Not because I was absolving myself, but because I was seeing the context more clearly. There were options, there always are, but none of them presented themselves as clean choices at the time. There was no sign that said, "Stop here." No number past a limit, no alarm, just a buildup of weak signals that didn't quite align into something solid. And that's the part few people understand. Complex systems don't fail like simple machines. They don't break all at once. They wear down while continuing to function. If I had stopped that flight, maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe the plane would have flown the next day without incident. Maybe I would have been seen as overly cautious, someone who creates problems where there aren't any. Maybe my career would have ended the same way, just with a different conversation. Those maybes don't lead anywhere. They only show how rarely the line between acceptable and unacceptable is visible before it's crossed. Over time, I stopped looking for a single moment where everything could have changed. I started looking at the whole, at how we learn to work close to limits, at how success teaches us to trust what has always worked, at how easily the word acceptable replaces harder questions. The system isn't evil. That matters. It's efficient. It organizes, regulates, allows incredibly complex things to happen every day with remarkable reliability. But it also teaches habits. And some habits only show their cost when it's already too late. One of the things that stayed with me most was how quickly the world continued. Not cruelly, inevitably. Planes kept flying. New manuals were written. New technicians were trained. The flight number became a data point in a statistic. That doesn't reduce the tragedy. It just shows that real scale. I continued, too. Not the same way, but I continued. Life outside work slowly took up more space. The relative I'd been caring for eventually needed decisions I had postponed for years. Decisions I'd always told myself could wait. When I finally had to make them, I saw how comfortable postponement had been, and how much it had quietly cost. There was no dramatic realization, just a simple understanding. I'd spent much of my life believing there would always be enough time, that when a true limit arrived, it would announce itself clearly, that urgency would show up unmistakably. It rarely does. Real urgency usually forms in silence. Sometimes I think about the new guy. I don't know where he is now. Probably still in aviation, probably still following manuals closely, and that's not wrong. The world needs that. I just hope that at some point he also learned to listen to what isn't written, not to ignore rules, but to understand where they end. I don't feel anger toward him. I never did. He did exactly what he was trained to do. That's how the system protects itself, by spreading responsibility so efficiently that no one carries it alone. Every now and then when I pass near a small airport, the kind that doesn't show up in brochures, I stop for a few minutes. I don't watch the planes so much as the people. Folks working, following routines, doing what needs to be done so something larger can happen. Everything looks normal, and it is. That normality is powerful. It holds the world together, but it also demands constant attention, not just technical, but human. If I had to recognize one thing, not as a lesson, but as an acknowledgement, it would be this: danger rarely lives in the obvious mistake. It lives in the accumulation of things done well enough. When everything works for a long time, we stop asking why. Today, when I hear a plane overhead, I don't think about crashes. I think about the entire path that brought that machine into the air. I think about the people who worked without ever appearing in a picture. I think about the small decisions, the quiet adjustments, The limits stretched just a little more, and I think that somewhere, someone is doing exactly what I did for years. Keeping everything within what's acceptable, trusting that it's enough. Most of the time, it is, but not always. I'm not telling this story to accuse anyone, not even myself. I'm telling it because it exists, because it happened, because it was built slowly, with good intentions, competence, and silence. The plane went down. That's the fact people remember. But the story isn't there. It's in the ordinary days that came before. In the moments when nothing felt urgent. In the seconds when someone said yes because, technically, there wasn't enough reason to say no. That's where everything is decided. The rest is noise, and noise given enough time always fades.